We're in for a long one today. Spectral Helix accuracy stacking, battlemage cry, Juggernaut. So after the initial ramp, this build reaches somewhere between 3 to 9 million DPS, depending on the number of hits. However, most of these clips were recorded on a 5-link without War Banner and without Transcendent Spirit. If you were with me on stream, you probably saw me go through about 3k fusings and a gallon of copium trying to deal with this perfect form. But disregarding the failed fusings, I've put roughly 15 exalts into this build to get it where it's at, and it can do most of the endgame. To get it comfortable for the endgame, you'd want to scale up the DPS just a little bit more, be a mechanically better player than I am, and also not have crafted life on almost all of my rares. It's not really well geared at this point. So, firstly, Spectral Helix. Let's talk about this skill. It can hit multiple times. So roughly at the baseline, you'd be hitting 2 times, but then with the helmet enchant of 1 additional rotation, you'd probably get 3, maybe 4 hits on an average sized boss that doesn't move. Now a lot of bosses do move, so you might not get that, but one of the ways in which we can counteract that is through projectile speed. So projectile speed helps not only clear, but it also helps with the consistency of the skill, letting it hit monsters more quickly. The other question with the skill is about additional projectiles, and in my opinion, additional projectiles is pretty much useless. It really only helps out with wall bounces for indoor maps, and I think as far as indoor maps go, you don't really care because your clear is kind of gimped anyway. Naturally, the POB link has most of the details for the build, but over here I wanted to go through some of the decisions I've made in terms of layering both defenses and offenses, and a couple of unique techs that I'm using in this specific setup. So firstly, Petrified Blood is actually a great defense because it gives you both overleech and it lets you use life-based reservation, and that's really big because a lot of builds, especially these kinds of builds, get a lot of flat life. So if you're preserving things like vitality, clarity, precision, anything that's flat reservation with your life, you can do that much more easily than if you were to preserve with your mana. Secondly, I'm using Arctic Armor as another defense, and this is given to us for free because I'm using Perfect Form. Perfect Form also gives us Phase Acrobatics, which gives me 30% spell dodge, for free as well. Elusive from Nightblade support also gives us more dodge and more spell dodge, and this is pretty underrated, especially when you're mapping around, you really feel the dodge. And then as a Juggernaut, you get Unflinching, Unrelenting, and Unbreakable. I'm taking all 3 defensive nodes, and I'm not going for the Freeze Immunity and Temp Chains node. I think that's a good way to start out, but I think it's a bit of a bait because you give up so much tankiness by giving up any of the 3 nodes that I am taking. And then I'm stacking a lot of armor through iron reflexes, so I'm converting the evasion that I get from Perfect Form and other places on my gear into armor, and this lets me use Vol Molten Shell and Molten Shell. I think these are a lot better than Steelskin and Immortal Call in this case, because you never really want to give up your endurance charges when you're a Juggernaut. Lastly, I do have block from claws and block from dual wielding, and I always pretty much have fortified because whirling blades is actually really important to the playstyle of this build. In terms of offenses, this is an accuracy stacker, and that's where we get most of our damage. It's actually from the boots, but the core uniques first. So Replica Last Resort, I've done a build with this before. These are the 2 claws I'm using. They used to be fairly cheap. I don't know how much they'll be right now. Obscurantis is a great helmet for projectile accuracy stackers. Oscar gives you Assassin's Mark on hit and lets you scale accuracy even further. Transcendent Spirit is probably the best jewel that you can put on your tree. I think each of those gives me something like 30% more DPS. Absolutely huge for accuracy stackers. I have 2 split personalities. These are pretty good, but they're actually really easily replaceable by rare jewels. You basically want to take these jewels and put them as far away from the router start as possible, and then you'll get a ton of life and accuracy. I think each of these costs roughly an exalt. And then as far as the rest of your rares go, you want accuracy, you want life, you want crit multi, and then you want resistances. It should be fairly easy to cap out resist because I'm taking a Lyra on this build. The second part of my offense is actually through Warcries. So I'm taking Call to Arms, which lets me use Warcries for free, and the Warcry that I'm choosing to use here is Battlemage's Cry. So it does 2 main things. Firstly, it allows me to use a cluster heal, which gives me Onslaught, and it also gives me Intimidate. So that's a 10% more damage, and I think somewhere around 7 or 8% more damage with Onslaught. Now I don't have full uptime on Onslaught, but that's okay. Even half uptime on it is really, really nice, and it helps me pick up loot, which is super important for me because you don't have a lot of move speed elsewhere. The second thing that Battlemage's Cry does is that it lets me actually trigger spells. So in this case, I'm triggering 2 spells, Summon Ice Golem and Hydrosphere. So Ice Golem is really good for the build because you get accuracy and you get crit chance, and these are huge stats. I think Ice Golem gives me somewhere between 10 to 13% depending on the state of my build. Hydrosphere doesn't have any interesting interactions with Spectral Helix, but it does allow me to apply exposure for lightning, and it has better duration than Wave of Conviction, so this allows me to keep exposure uptime on bosses, where I might not want to move so much at certain times. Now the way in which I'm actually triggering Battlemage's Cry is through Whirling Blades. So you might not want to use Whirling Blades because you want to get your damage out, right? But Whirling Blades is both triggering spells and giving us Fortify. Also, there's a lot of opportunities to reposition during boss fights and while mapping, so I think making sure that you're integrating Whirling Blades into the playstyle is actually really core for both offense and defense. The last really weird thing on the tree is that I'm taking Blood Magic, but I'm not taking Mortal Conviction. So that's the node at the very back of Blood Magic. So for this build, running Blood Magic actually lets me use 5 auras because I'm also using Arctic Armor with Perfect Form. I'm able to preserve in only using my life pool. Vitality, Precision, Petrified Blood, and War Banner. Although I do need an Enlighten, or I can path towards Sovereignty or any of the other sort of reduced reservation nodes on the tree. I could anoint them if I really wanted to. Unlike Arrogant support, Blood Magic doesn't increase the reservation multiplier for these auras, so I'm actually able to much more easily reserve auras onto life without worrying about things like an insane, 35% up to a 70% multiplier for Petrified Blood, which is why I can use Petrified Blood and all these flat reservation auras in my life pool. The second thing that Blood Magic lets us do really easily is preload damage. So if anyone's ever played Spectral Throw, you kind of want to preload and start throwing your Spectral Throws right away before the boss spawns. Now, one of the ways in which you used to do this is by stacking a lot of minus mana cost of skills. And this is okay, but you might still run out of mana. Blood Magic basically lets us do this for free because the life cost is really negligible when you're running Vitality. And then you'll have a lot of leech when the boss actually does spawn. And this preload for Spectral Helix is really, really important if you think about what the endgame bosses look like, right? Sirius you can preload, Shaper you can preload. Uber at 0 you can preload, Cortex you can preload. There's a bunch of scenarios in which this preload of damage is really, really helpful for Spectral Helix and actually lets you hit a much bigger DPS spike than you would otherwise. Now in terms of future optimizations, I'm looking at flasks. I don't really know what to do with my flask right now. I haven't thought about it. I know Bottle of Faith is really great for the build. It gives you still a good amount of crit and the increase in damage is pretty strong. Secondly, there's a boot enchant for 10% penetration if you haven't killed recently. You don't really lack damage while you're mapping. This is super helpful for bossing. Thirdly, all of my rares need to be upgraded. None of the rares in my build, including jewels, cost me more than 40 chaos to buy. All of these can be better. All of these should give me much more life, and I should be aiming for somewhere between 6.5 to 7k life before I'm using Petrified Blood. Fourth, I'm not sure I want to stick with these claw corruptions. I think there's a lot of different things I could do here. Block is probably one of the worst things that you want. Crit multi is good, attack speed is good, base crit is good. All of these are offensive options, and I think scaling offenses in this particular scenario is actually much better. Fifth, my Watcher's Eye is already really good. It gives me life gain on hit with Vitality, which is really important for when you're running Petrified Blood. It is able to counteract a lot of the degens you experience while you're mapping. But I would like to get some sort of offensive modifier in there as well. Maybe something to do with precision, crit multi, attack damage, attack speed on precision. These are all great for my build. If you look at my large cluster jewel, this is basically a one prop cluster jewel giving me wind up. The other mod is pretty much useless because I don't have mana leech. I could improve this jewel, I've been too lazy as well. Lastly, I do need to level my gems. In my actual build, none of my gems are properly leveled because I'm only at level 92 right now. Leveling these up to level 20 with quality 20 makes a big difference in your damage, and I wouldn't ignore this. Now, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this build in particular, is that Juggernaut can be pretty fast. It's not always the super slow Herald of Agony or Righteous Fire or just like tankiness stacking ascendancy. It actually has a lot of potential to be really quick, and especially in the current meta where Quicksilver Flask has been nerfed, Smokebind's been nerfed, having really fast Whirling Blades as your means of getting around can make a build feel really, really great. One last announcement, please don't quit the league. Trade is super dead right now, and there's no one to trade with, and for me to actually make new builds, or for anyone to make new builds, or for anyone to do anything interesting that isn't completely solo self-found, you need to have other players playing the league with you. I know it sucks, but I promise it's not actually that bad. You're not actually going to be that weak, and once you figure out the different ways to solve the problems, I promise you'll feel maybe half as strong as you did in past leagues. It's really not that bad, guys.